I didn't know his name. I didn't know who he was. I only knew that 2 men had been following me for 6 blocks, and that the stranger walking into the Hanover Grand Hotel was the first person all night who looked like he could stop them. So I grabbed his arm. "Please," I whispered, "pretend you know me." He looked down at my hand, then over my shoulder and said quietly, "You picked the wrong stranger." I thought he was joking. Then every person in that lobby stepped aside at once. A security guard lowered his eyes. 3 men in black suits materialized behind him, and someone whispered, "That's Adrian Voss." My blood went cold. The most feared mafia boss alive, and I was still holding his arm. 3 hours earlier, I had been a woman with an ordinary problem. My name is Nora Bennett, I'm 31, and I work as a forensic accountant at Hale & Mercer, which means I spend my days finding the lie hidden inside other people's numbers. That night I was leaving a client reception at the Whitmore Club, tired, underdressed for the cold, and ready for my own bed. The first man was standing near the coat check, pretending to read his phone. The second was across the street when I came out, collar up, not pretending anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then I turned a corner, and they turned it too. 6 blocks. They matched every turn, every pause, never hurrying, like they had all night and knew it. I didn't lead them home. I led them toward light, toward people, toward the Hanover Grand, and toward him. Back in that lobby, the 2 men had stopped at the entrance, suddenly very interested in the floor. Adrian looked at them the way you look at furniture you're deciding whether to keep. "The lady is with me," he said. And it wasn't loud, but the whole room reorganized itself around the sentence. The 2 men exchanged one look, and then they were gone. Just like that. No argument, no scene, no raised voices. I had never seen power that quiet before. He walked me to a private lounge off the lobby, his hand near my elbow without ever touching it, and asked me what happened. I heard myself lie first, some polished little story about an overeager acquaintance, and then I heard myself stop and tell the truth instead. 2 men. 6 blocks. No idea why. He listened without interrupting, and something about the way he listened made me talk more than I meant to. Somewhere in the middle of my own voice, my memory caught up with me. I knew the name Voss. Everyone who read a newspaper knew it. A federal indictment that collapsed. 2 investigations that evaporated. A photograph of a man leaving a courthouse like a man leaving a dentist appointment. My hands had started to shake, and he saw it, because of course he saw it. He seemed like a man who saw everything. "You can leave whenever you want," he said. "The front door, a car, or the police. Your choice, and nobody in this building will stop you." He said it flatly, like a man listing exits on an airplane, and somehow that was the first moment my breathing slowed. He could have kept me there with a word. Instead, he handed me the word and let me use it myself. I chose to go home. He nodded once, and a broad, quiet man named Tomas appeared and drove me in a car so silent I could hear my own pulse. Before I got out, Adrian gave me a matte black card with a single number on it. No name. "If they come back," he said, "call me before you run." Then the door closed, and the most dangerous man in the city drove away into the dark. If you were me, would you trust the stranger who saved you, or run the moment you discovered he was a mafia boss? Tell me in the comments, because I still think about what I would have done if I'd known his name before I grabbed his arm. I didn't sleep that night. I checked every lock twice and pushed a chair under the doorknob like a woman in a movie, except movies end, and mine didn't. In the morning there were fine, fresh scratches around my deadbolt, bright little curls of new metal. Nothing was missing. That was the part that turned my stomach, because a thief takes something, and these people had only wanted me to know they'd been there. The building super said the hallway cameras were out for maintenance. They had been out, I later learned, for exactly 1 night. I went to work anyway, because work is a religion when your life tilts. Hale & Mercer was glass and quiet and safe, until lunchtime, when I saw one of the men from the night before standing in my lobby, reading the directory like a tourist. Security walked me to the elevators, and promised to call the police. I stood in the elevator watching the doors close and understood, with perfect clarity, that the police couldn't fix this in a day. I called the number on the black card. He answered before the second ring, and all he said was, "Where are you?" I told him. "A car is coming," he said. "Gray. Thomas is driving. No one else gets in, do you understand? Not police, not colleagues, no one." I understood. 20 minutes later, I was in the back of that silent car, watching my ordinary life recede in the side mirror like a shoreline. He was 38, 7 years older than me, and he lived in a tall, understated building on the park, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. His study was all wood and shadow, and he asked me my full name like a man confirming a reservation. Nora Bennett, I said. He went very still, the way he had in the lobby, and then he said, Walter Bennett's daughter. It wasn't a question. I hadn't told him my father's name. I hadn't told anyone my father's name in years. My father ran Bennett Archive Services, a document custody firm most people had never heard of. Half the old corporations in the city stored their paper with him, contracts and ledgers and the boring, dangerous history of money, and he guarded it all like a priest guarding confessionals. He died 3 years ago, a heart attack at his desk, surrounded by other people's secrets. I sold the building. I kept his personal ledgers and the client index in a storage unit, because I couldn't bear to shred him. Adrian told me that someone had been quietly buying up my father's old storage contracts for almost 2 years, company by company, box by box. Then, 3 weeks ago, the buying stopped, and the hunting started. The men from the hotel weren't after a random woman on a cold street, they were after Walter Bennett's daughter, which meant they believed I could open something they couldn't. I just didn't know what, and neither, yet, did I. What unsettled me most was the way Adrian said my father's name, like a man reading it off a list he had memorized a long time ago. I asked him what he wanted with the archive, and for the first time he hesitated. Something your father protected, he said finally. I'll explain when I can prove it. It was not an answer. It was the shape of an answer, held behind glass, and we both knew it. He offered me temporary protection while we figured out what was happening. A guest suite, his resources, and I did what I always do when I'm afraid. I made a list. My job. My keys. My phone. No decisions made about me without me, and the right to walk out any day, no argument, no debt. I said it all out loud, expecting a negotiation, bracing for the fine print that men like him always hide. There was no fine print. He accepted every condition without arguing, and then added one of his own. My door locked from my side, and Thomas answered to me as well as to him. Something in my chest loosened by exactly one notch. It wasn't trust. I want to be honest with you about that, because it matters later. It was the first brick in a foundation I didn't know I was building. That first night, I lay in a bed softer than any I'd ever owned and listened to a penthouse settle around me. I kept my phone in my hand and my shoes by the bed, ready to run. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps pause outside my door, and my whole body went rigid. Then I heard him walk away. He had only been checking that the hallway light was off. He hadn't tried the handle. Nobody tried the handle, that night or any night after it. The next morning there was a key on the kitchen counter with my name on the tag, and a note in precise, slanted handwriting. Thomas is downstairs if you want him. If you don't, you won't see him. I stood there holding that note for a long moment. He could have assigned me a shadow and called it safety. Instead, he gave me a key and a choice, and left both on the counter like they weighed the same. I went to work. I want you to understand how strange that sentence is. By day, I reconciled accounts and traced shell payments. And by night, I slept under the roof of a man the federal government couldn't touch. I kept waiting for the cage door to close, for the moment the courtesy curdled into control. It never did. Every evening he asked where I'd been the way you ask a roommate, not a prisoner. The first crack in his reputation came on a Tuesday. I was getting water from the kitchen past midnight when I saw Marco, the chef, on the phone in the pantry, voice cracking about his daughter's surgery bill. The next day the hospital called back. The bill had been settled by an anonymous donor. Marco never knew. But I had seen Adrian at his desk that afternoon, initialing something on hospital letterhead and sliding it into a drawer like it was nothing. After that, I started keeping a private list of things that didn't match. The headline said ruthless, and I watched him stop a meeting because the housekeeper's grandson had a fever, and she kept glancing at her phone. The rumors said monster, and I watched him remember the name of every doorman's kid. Feared by everyone, feared for nothing I could see. A forensic accountant trusts evidence. The evidence was not cooperating with the legend. On a rainy Thursday, he took me out the back way to a small cafe he owned through 3 layers of companies. The first time I'd seen him in daylight doing something ordinary. He drank espresso. He asked about my work, really asked. The follow-up kind of asking, and listened while I explained a fraud I'd unraveled. Somewhere between the second espresso and the rain on the windows. I forgot to be afraid of him for almost an entire hour. That was the day I told him. For the record, I grabbed you because you looked like the safest man in the room. He looked at me over his cup. You thought I looked safe. It was dark, I said. You were wearing a nice suit. It was a field decision. And Adrian Voss, the most feared man in the city, laughed. A real laugh, rusty around the edges, like a door opening that had been painted shut for years. The boundary test came the following week. I told him I wanted to visit my father's old office. The new owners hadn't finished clearing it, and I wanted to see it once more. He didn't forbid it. He didn't frown. He put 2 sets of keys on the table and said, Thomas drives you, or you go alone. Tell me which, and I'll make the other happen. I picked Thomas. But the whole point, is that he made me pick. The office was dust and empty shelves, and the ghost of my father's cologne in the wood. In a bottom drawer the buyers hadn't bothered with, I found his daily ledgers, 5 of them, written in his personal shorthand, full of dates and client codes, and margin notes only he could read. I took them home in a grocery bag, like contraband. That night they sat on my desk feeling heavier than paper should feel, and I couldn't have told you why. Over the following weeks I saw the other empire. Not the one in the newspapers, the legitimate one. Voss Holdings, with properties and a bank acquisition in progress and a hospital wing he was funding through a foundation. He was converting everything he could into daylight, piece by piece, like a man renovating a house while still living in it. I had spent my career watching dirty money pretend to be clean. He was doing the opposite, and it was harder, and he was doing it anyway. One night, late, over papers neither of us was reading, he said, My father lost everything to men who owned judges. I built an empire they couldn't touch. Now I'm building one they can't use against me. He didn't look at me while he said it. It wasn't the whole truth. I could feel the shape of what he wasn't saying, but it was a crack in the wall, and cracks are how the light gets in. I didn't push. I just remembered it. That was when I realized our interests actually overlapped. His legitimate businesses needed exactly what I did for a living. Someone who could smell a forged invoice from across a room. So I offered, on my terms, to audit his clean books for irregularities. Invoiced, contracted, like any client. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, small and real, and said, Send me a contract. I did. He signed it without changing a single clause. We worked side by side most evenings after that, spreadsheets between us like a chessboard. He brought me tea without asking how I took it after the second night, because he'd watched me make it once. Trust. I was learning. Doesn't arrive like lightning. It accumulates in boring, precious increments, until one day you realize you've stopped counting your exits. I caught myself noticing his hands, his patience, the way he said my name. That was a new kind of danger entirely. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to hear from you. Do you think Adrian genuinely cared about Nora, or was he hiding another reason for protecting her? Comment your theory, because the truth is more complicated than either answer, and it started unraveling on a Monday morning, when his flagship legitimate project lost its financing in the space of a single phone call. The North Bank development was supposed to be his proof of concept, the crown jewel of Voss Holdings. The bank pulled out citing newly surfaced compliance documents, internal documents, figures that had existed in exactly one place, Adrian's private office. I watched him stand at the window for a long time, choosing calm the way other men choose a weapon. 3 people knew those numbers, he said quietly. And looking at his face, I understood that one of those 3 might soon appear to be me. 2 weeks later, the private bank he was acquiring got ambushed by a regulatory tip that read like an insider's memo. Then a supplier deal soured on information that shouldn't have existed outside his inner circle. Someone inside was feeding someone outside, surgically, patiently, and every leak had one thing in common. It took me 3 days of staring at the leaked pages to see it, and when I finally did, my stomach turned over. The leaked documents were dressed in my father's filing system, old Bennett archive client codes, his formatting, his numbering conventions, worn like a costume. Whoever was sabotaging Adrian was doing it while pointing, with every forged page, at Walter Bennett's archive. At me. I brought it to Adrian with my hands cold, and he didn't ask if I was sure. He asked me to walk him through every code twice, and he wrote nothing down. Because some things you keep in your head. That night I woke at 2 a.m. and found him in the study with my father's ledgers open, reading the shorthand he shouldn't have been able to read, but was slowly teaching himself. He looked up, and there was something in his face I'd never seen there before. Your father was careful, he said, in the way men only are when they're protecting something. The room went very quiet. We both knew we were past the point where this was just about me. It got worse before it got clearer. A courier delivered an envelope to Adrian's office containing 3 pages from my father's personal ledgers, pages that should have been inside a locked unit only I could open. When Thomas checked, the storage lock showed no damage, but the logbook had a signature. Mine. Forged, and well forged, but forged. I hadn't been near that unit in 8 months. And now someone had made it look like I had. The morning after the logbook forgery, Thomas found a plain envelope taped beneath my car's windshield wiper, no stamp, no address, just my first name written in block letters. Inside was a single photograph. Me, leaving the Hanover Grand on Adrian's arm, taken from across the street that first night. On the back, in the same block letters, someone had written, "Ask him what he really wants." It was a cheap trick. The worst part is that it worked, for about an hour, because cheap tricks are aimed at the doubts you already carry. I gave the photograph to Adrian instead of hiding it, and I watched him read the back twice. Then he did something I didn't expect. He handed it back and said, "Whatever answer you're afraid of, ask me the question. I'll answer it in front of Thomas, in front of anyone." So I asked him, right there in the kitchen, whether I was a person or a key to a lock. He said, "Both. You were a key long before you were a person to me. You're a person now." That's the confession, and it's the only one I've got. It wasn't a romantic answer. It was better than romantic, because it was true. And truth was the only currency that could have bought me at that point. I kept the photograph in a drawer instead of throwing it away, the way you keep a splinter after you've pulled it out. Proof that something got under your skin and didn't win. Years of reading fraudulent books had taught me that the smallest documents are usually the ones someone most wants you to ignore. The whispering started inside his organization within days. I heard it in the pauses, in the way certain men stopped talking when I entered a room. The math was ugly and simple. Leaks dressed in my father's codes, a forged logbook with my name, and a woman who had appeared out of nowhere the night the trouble started. If I had designed a frame, I couldn't have done it better, and the frame was pointed at me. Relis, his consigliere, came to him in front of me with his voice full of regret, and his eyes full of arithmetic. "You have to consider the possibility," he said gently, like a man delivering terrible news he had rehearsed. I watched Adrian look at him for a long, silent moment, and then I heard the sentence I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "I consider everything," Adrian said. "But I don't accuse people without proof. Least of all her. You have to understand something. I had spent weeks waiting for the mask to slip, for the control to show its teeth, for the moment he would decide I was a liability and handle me the way men like him handle liabilities. Instead, with evidence stacked against me by a professional, he stood between me and the accusation without blinking. That was the night suspicion finally finished dying. I didn't fall for his power. I fell for the moment his power was hardest to use, and he used it to give me the benefit of the doubt. There was a quieter cost to those weeks that I haven't told you about. My friends thought I'd taken a consulting job out of state. My landlady thought I was traveling. My whole life fit into 2 suitcases and a grocery bag of ledgers, and some evenings, alone in a suite that cost more per night than my first car. I would sit on the floor and miss my own terrible apartment, so intensely it felt like grief. Safety, it turns out, is not the same thing as a life. Adrian understood that before I did. One evening he found me repacking a suitcase I didn't remember unpacking, and instead of asking what I was doing, he said, "If you left tomorrow, I'd have Thomas drive you, and no one would ever follow. You know that." I said I knew. He said, "Then the fact that you're still here is the only thing I trust." It was the closest either of us had come to saying the word out loud, and we both let it stand there, unfiled, like a document neither of us was ready to sign. I should also tell you about the night I almost left for real. It was after the second leak, when the whispers started, and a man at one of Adrian's dinners looked at me a half-second too long. I got as far as the lobby with my suitcase before I stopped. Not because anyone stopped me, But because I realized I was doing exactly what the forger wanted. Whoever was dressing those leaks in my father's codes needed me frightened, isolated, and running. So I turned around and took the elevator back up. It was the bravest thing I did in this entire story, and nobody saw it. After Relis left, I stood there not trusting my voice, and Adrian just poured me a glass of water and set it down within reach. "You didn't do this," he said. "So we find who did." "We." I caught him glancing at me when he thought I was working. I caught myself doing the same. One evening, my hand brushed his reaching for the same file, and neither of us moved away for a full second. Neither of us mentioned it. Both of us remembered it. So I did what I do. I took my father's 5 ledgers apart, page by page, the way he taught me when I was 19 and bored, and he was teaching me to read what money was hiding. Beneath the surface entries, there was a second structure, dates and invoice fragments threaded through the margins in his shorthand. It took me a week to see it, because he had built it to be invisible to everyone but a Bennett. My father had left me a message. He had just needed the world to believe it was an ordinary ledger. The ledgers themselves became our evenings. Adrian cleared his schedule 3 nights a week, which Thomas told me he had never done for anyone, and we spread my father's shorthand across the dining table like a language we were both learning together. He was better at the people, I was better at the numbers, and somewhere in the overlap the case stopped being his or mine and became ours. I noticed I had started saying "we" in my own head before I ever said it out loud to him. There was one entry in the 3rd ledger that I skipped for days because I wasn't ready for it. My father's shorthand, dated 4 months before he died. They offered again, doubled. Told them the archive isn't for sale because the truth isn't for sale. If anything happens to me, the order of the pages is the key. I read it standing in the middle of the study floor with Adrian 10 feet away, and I had to sit down. He didn't ask what it said. He just moved the chair closer and waited until I could say it myself. The message was a chain of custody. Every irregular document my father had ever been asked to store, quietly duplicated, indexed, and cross-referenced with the company that requested it. Together the fragments mapped a network, judges, officials, shell corporations, and at the center of it all, a name that kept surfacing like a body in a river. The Callaway Group. A consortium that had spent 20 years quietly owning pieces of the city's business establishment, one compromised signature at a time. My father had stumbled onto their paper trail by accident, the way you stumble onto a landmine. Instead of running, he documented everything and hid it in plain sight, because he knew that the day it surfaced, someone would need to be able to prove it. He'd been protecting a bomb. And 3 years after his death, someone had finally figured out where it was buried. That's why 2 men followed me out of the Whitmore Club. Not to hurt me. To take what they believed I had. The Callaway Group had approached my father first. I found the correspondence copies, polite, patient, offering him money to quietly lose certain boxes. He refused. They pressured. He documented the pressure. He told no one, not even me, because telling me would have made me a target, and he died at his desk before he could decide what to do with what he had built. I sat on the floor of my suite surrounded by his shorthand, and cried for the man who had spent his last years quietly arming a stranger's future. And then I understood the real shape of the whole thing, and it rearranged every week I'd lived through. The Callaway Group didn't want me dead, Ed. I was useless. They wanted me discredited and delivered, the forged logbook, the leaks in my father's codes, all of it designed so that when I surfaced with the ledgers, nobody would believe me. And the someone inside Adrian's house dressing every leak in my family's codes had to be someone who knew the ledgers existed. There were only 3 people who knew. Cross-reference is my native language. The leaked pages used a numbering quirk my father reserved for files he personally supervised, and there was only one way anyone living would know that quirk existed. Someone had already seen the original archive index, someone who had been quietly buying my father's old contracts for 2 years, and stopped 3 weeks before I was followed. The buying had never been about the boxes. It had been about learning the filing language, and the only person with both the access and the patience was already inside. The order of the pages was the key. The fragments weren't random. Read in the sequence my father had physically numbered them. They reconstructed entire transactions, date, amount, signatory, and the company that requested the storage. It took me 4 nights to reassemble the full chain, and when I finished, I had the Callaway Group's 20 years laid out in my dead father's handwriting. like a letter that had finally found its address. I sat back and understood that he hadn't died leaving me unprotected. He had died leaving me armed. Adrian read the reconstructed chain in silence for almost an hour. When he finally looked up, his voice was different, lower, stripped of the performance he wore for the rest of the world. "This is what I've been looking for since before you knew my name," he said. "Men who own judges can only be beaten in daylight, and daylight is exactly what this is." For the first time, I understood that his protection of me had never been charity or strategy. It had been two searches colliding, his for the truth, mine for somewhere safe to stand. The ledger didn't name the insider, but it told me where to look. The Callaway Group's paper trail intersected with Voss Holdings at exactly one node, a consulting arrangement from 11 years ago, before Adrian went legitimate, handled on his behalf by one man. A man who had been at his side since before the empire had walls. Relis. The consigliere with the rehearsed regret, the man who had stood in front of me and gently suggested I might be the problem, while wearing my father's filing system like a stolen coat. I brought it to Adrian at midnight, and I watched something happen to his face that I hope you never have to see on anyone you care about. Relis had been with him for 20 years. Had carried him out of a burning car once. There was a scar on Adrian's shoulder I had never asked about. Adrian read my work 3 times, looking for the flaw, and I watched him find none. Then he closed the ledger very gently, the way you close a door in a house where someone is sleeping, and said, "Show me how you know. Not, you're wrong. Not, how dare you. Show me." The most feared man in the city, handed the worst news of his life by a woman he'd known for 2 months, chose to treat her like the expert she was. So I showed him, line by line, for 3 hours, and somewhere in the second hour he stopped looking at the paper and started looking at me, and I understood that whatever this was between us had finished becoming something neither of us could file away. He did not take over. That is the thing I need you to hear, because it is the thing that decided everything after. Any other man with his power would have absorbed my discovery into his own machinery and handled it the way his world handles betrayal. Instead, he said, "It's your father's work. You present it." And he meant it. He sat at the table like a witness while Walter Bennett's daughter laid the whole architecture out for the 2 men Adrian trusted most. The confirmation came from the one account nobody could explain. When the Callaway Group moved money for Relis, it moved through a conduit that had once been my father's client, and the payment pattern matched, date for date, the evenings Relis had privately scheduled Adrian's movements. Sabotage as a calendar. I didn't confront anyone. I'm not built for confrontation. I'm built for documentation. So we documented, and we let Relis build his own case against himself, one confident mistake at a time. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep, and neither could he. We ended up on the terrace at 3 in the morning with a city of 11 million strangers lit up below us, and he told me about the burning car, the scar on his shoulder, the 20 years of Relis standing between him and the worst of his own world. "Tomorrow I find out whether gratitude was ever real or always a ledger entry," he said. I didn't offer comfort. I offered what I had. "Then tomorrow you'll know the truth," I said. "You taught me that's always better." I want to be honest about something else. Part of me had been bracing, the whole time, for the reveal that he had engineered everything, that the 2 men outside the Whitmore Club had been his, that my fear had been a door he'd built so he could be the one to open it. I checked. Of course I checked. It's what I do. The tale predated his knowledge of me by 11 days, and the buyers of my father's contracts traced back to a Callaway shell, never to his. His hands were many things. On that one question, they were clean. The end came at a board meeting for the bank acquisition, in a glass room 40 floors above the city. Relis arrived smiling, carrying a folder designed to finish me. More forged ledger pages, a story about the accountant who had played the boss. He got 4 sentences in before Adrian asked him, conversationally, to explain a payment from 11 years ago. I watched Relis understand, in real time, that the room had been arranged around him. Men who had served him for years stood very still. Nobody shouted. Nobody needed to. What I remember most is not Relis's face. It's Adrian's voice, quiet and absolutely even, telling the man who had saved his life that the debt was now paid in full, and that mercy was the price of the old car and the old scar. There was no violence in that room. There was something colder and cleaner, a choice, offered once, To walk into a retirement of silence and federal questions, or to learn what the other version looked like. Relis chose the retirement. The Calloway Group chose the headlines. The Calloway Group died of daylight. Not in one dramatic night, the way the movies would want, but across 6 weeks of indictments, resignations, and front-page photographs of handcuffed men in good suits. My father's evidence did exactly what he built it to do. His name was in every story, not as a victim, but as the man who had seen it coming and left the door open behind him. I stood at his grave the week the last indictment landed and told him the filing system worked. I like to think he already knew. The night the last headline ran, Adrian finally told me the rest, and this time the hesitation was gone. That night at the Hanover wasn't the first time I'd heard your family name, he said. 2 years ago I learned there was a man named Bennett, whose archive held the proof that could finish the network that had been bleeding this city, since before I had a name. I searched for him. I was 3 months too late, so I searched for whatever he'd left behind, and everyone he might have left it with. You were on a list, he said. A photograph, a resume, an address I told my people never to approach, because the last thing that man would have wanted was my world knocking on his daughter's door. I had been looking for Walter Bennett's legacy for 2 years. I never expected it to walk into a hotel lobby, grab my arm, and ask me to pretend I knew her. He looked at me then, and the most feared man in the city smiled like the punchline of a joke only the two of us would ever fully understand. You picked the wrong stranger, he said. Thank God. I should tell you what I did with that, because it matters. I didn't fall into his arms. I went home to my own apartment for a week, the way we'd agreed I always could, and I let myself miss him without any danger attached, to find out what was left when the fear was subtracted. What was left was everything. The tea made the way I liked it. The 3 hours of show me. The hand near my elbow, never holding it. I knocked on his door on the 7th night, and he opened it, and neither of us pretended anything. A month later he put a contract in front of me, and for one heartbeat I was back in the beginning, bracing for fine print. It wasn't fine print. It was a genuine stake in Voss Holdings, the legitimate empire, with my name on it. This isn't payment, he said before I could speak, and it isn't because you're mine. It's because the one thing this organization never had was someone who could look at the whole board and see what nobody else saw. You don't belong to me, Nora. You proved you belong beside me. I negotiated 2 clauses. He laughed and signed. That's who we became. The feared man and the forensic accountant. Board meetings in the morning, the backstreet cafe on Thursdays, arguments about strategy that he sometimes let me win because I was right. The empire he was building into the daylight now had 2 signatures at the bottom of everything that mattered. His enemies still crossed the street when they saw him coming. His partners learned, quickly, to also watch for the woman standing beside him. Last week we were walking out of the Hanover Grand, of all places, after a fundraiser, and I stopped him at the door where it all started. Do you remember the first thing I ever asked you? He smiled, the real one, the one the city doesn't get to see. You asked me to pretend I knew you. I took his hand, right there under the lights where I'd once grabbed a stranger's sleeve in terror, and I said the truest thing I know. I don't need you to pretend anymore. So tell me in the comments, if you were Nora, would you have chosen Adrian after discovering why he had been searching for you? And subscribe for more stories like this one, because the most dangerous thing that ever happened to me was also the only one I'd never take back. I grabbed a stranger's arm to escape. I just didn't know I was grabbing the rest of my life.